So farmers are doing terrible, and what can they do about it? Just like labor, there's only one option if the farmers are going to get any of these changes, and that is to organize. So farmers in the 1870s, they will start organizing, and they will try two organizations that both fail but teach them valuable lessons. The very first is the Grange. And this organization is still around today. It's the oldest agricultural organization in U.S. history. Started as a social thing where they got together and exchanged information. And then, as their numbers grew, they realized they had to get into politics. So it got up to like 1.5 million members. And the Grange will have some success, and this is important to know. They get past some things called the Granger laws. It's important to know for your paper. They get past things called the Granger laws, which included a lot of things, but most notably, regulation of railroads. And this was passed in Illinois, and among other places, but in Illinois especially, the Grange got the state government to pass laws to regulate the railroads. This was absolutely huge, but there was a problem. States cannot regulate any business that goes over state lines. It is in the Constitution. It's called the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Clause. The only level of government that constitutionally can regulate business that go across state lines is the federal government. So these Granger laws, the railroads took them to court, and they were ruled unconstitutional because the Constitution is very clear about that. It has to be the federal government that regulates. And make sure you understand this, because that is why the federal government, part of the reason the federal government will keep growing, because businesses keep growing, these corporations keep growing, and so the federal government is the only level of government that can regulate them. So the Grange, technically it's still around, but it doesn't amount to very much. And it will go out of existence, or it'll fade away, and it's replaced by what's called the Farmers' Alliances. The Farmers' Alliances, it's called alliances in the plural because there were three of them. There were farmers in the West, farmers in the South they grew totally different things. And there was a third one for African Americans. That's why it is in the plural. They will call for stuff like free silver, but they will end up going out of existence also. And these two, the only thing you have to know about these two farm organizations is the three things that they showed farmers. First and foremost, that farmers could organize. And that's important for farmers to know that they have the potential to organize, because the Farmers Alliance has got up to like 5 million members, so it was fairly large. Second thing this showed them was that if they were going to have any change of the issues that they need, free silver, lowering the tariff, regulation of railroads, they have to do it at the federal level. States cannot do any of those. So they have to work at the federal level. And third, working with African Americans. And this is so important to the populist movement. Again, throughout U.S. history, there are very few periods where poor blacks and poor whites work together in organizing large political parties. This is an exception. Why would poor whites work with poor blacks during this period? Because they're both at the same socioeconomic level, and they're all hurting. Make sure you understand this, because we will come back to this later. But make sure you understand they're all poor and they're all hurting. And what is the one thing that poor people will always have above rich people? Numbers. There will always be more of them. So Poor whites and poor blacks, they will actually work together during this period, which again, it's fairly anomalous, and it only lasts for a little while. The most important farm party that represents agriculture in U.S. history, is the Populist Party. And so it built on the Grange and the Farmers' Alliances. And in 1890, they will form the Populist Party, or the People's Party. This party isn't around for very long, but in the short time it is very important. So they form in 1890, and it will get so many members because so many farmers are doing so bad that by 1892, they have enough people to run a candidate in the presidential election. That is how bad farmers are doing. They will nominate for president a guy named James Weaver, and for vice president a guy named James Field. James Weaver was a general for the Union during the Civil War, and Field was a general for the Confederacy. They're obviously sending a clear message: we're all united. All of us farmers are united. And they held their convention in Omaha, Nebraska. That's how you can tell how agricultural and rural the party is. Most conventions are like Chicago, New York, some major city. They held it in Omaha. And they will come up with the Omaha platform, and this is so important. You really need to know this. Because what they will call for at the time was a lot of it was considered radical. But most of this stuff is passed in the future. Omaha platform, it is the blueprint for reform in the United States for years to come. And again, most of it will eventually pass. First and foremost, they want a progressive income tax. This means the more you make, the more you pay. Tariffs are bad for the majority of the population, consumers. And they're what's called regressive. It is where the government is taxing poor people to a greater degree than rich people. And just so you know, that is the norm throughout human history, is small group of people that control the government and extracting the wealth from the poor people. That is a regressive system. That's the norm throughout most of human history. They wanted a progressive income tax. So this flips that on its head. The wealthy should pay more to the government than poor. It's not that poor people don't pay anything, it's just wealthy people should pay more since they have more. So having a progressive tax system, that is an anomaly of 20th century, but that was novel. They also called for direct election of U.S. senators. U.S. senators, according to the U.S. Constitution, are chosen by state legislatures. So, for example, during this period, the New York State Legislature, New York House of Representatives and Senate, they will nominate, or they get to pick who's going to be the senators. This made it so senators were bought out by the richest people. What the populists wanted was for senators to be elected by the people directly. So the founding fathers they put a lot of things in to try to tamp down on democracy. This is an attempt to increase democracy in the United States. Third, they called for a flexible currency. This means more money in circulation. And they wanted this two ways. One, free silver, which we've talked about, unlimited coinage of silver to increase the amount of money. The second one was called a sub-treasury system. This is where the federal government will set up basically warehouses, and farmers can store their non-perishable staple crops. So stuff like grain and cotton, stuff that doesn't go bad. If you're a cotton farmer and the price of cotton is just terribly low, you can take your cotton, go to one of these sub-treasury systems to store your cotton, and the government will give you essentially money. It's more complicated than that, but just think of it as money. And so then that cotton is held there until the price goes up and there's a higher demand, and then it can be sold. And in the meantime, that money that is coming out from the sub-treasury system, that is going to increase the money supply. So what this is doing is solving two problems the farmers have. One, overproduction, and two, increasing the money supply. This was considered very radical because it is the government very actively helping, getting very actively engaged to help a part of the population. And I know the government was helping businesses, but that's, helping poor people, that's the radical part of this. The fourth part, government ownership of the railroad, telephone, and telegraph system in the United States. And this is the definition of socialism. Government ownership, not regulation, ownership of railroads, telephones, and telegraphs. This tells you how much farmers are hurting. That they are now calling for government ownership of railroads, cell phones, telegraph. Their argument was these things are so important that they need to be completely owned and controlled by the U.S. government. Now, again, you must know what socialism is. This is socialism. Now, they're not saying that the government should take over like Standard Oil and steel, American steel, but this is still a huge move in a radical direction for the United States. That is the reason this is so important. The Omaha Platform, again, most of this stuff will eventually be passed. Not the government ownership, but the other parts will all be passed. So the populists, they're hurting so much, farmers are hurting so much. What they're calling for, though, is a complete rejection of laissez-faire, the dominant political philosophy, and radicalism, socialism. That is what happens when people are hurting economically. They call for radical things. So in the election, Benjamin Harrison, he was the incumbent. He was the president. He's a Republican. Democrats will nominate Grover Cleveland. He had already won once, if you remember, and then he lost to Benjamin Harrison. He's running again. And those two were actually incredibly nice to each other because they were terrified of James Weaver. They were terrified of the populists because populists are calling for radical things. A lot of Americans were. Teddy Roosevelt was horrified by the populists. So it was a lot of people that were really afraid of what the populists stood for and what they were calling for. Ultimately, Cleveland won. Cleveland won and he will become president. And obviously he was very conservative. He was a Northern Democrat from New York, but very conservative. And totally opposed everything the populists were for. And he will win, and the populists get destroyed. But take a look at this map. So the populists, they've been around for 2 years, and they won 4 states: Nevada, Idaho, Colorado, and Kansas. They were supported by farmers, but also silver miners, obviously, because silver miners are going to make a lot of money with free silver, and that's why Nevada and Colorado voted for them. There's a lot of silver there. But they actually got 1 million votes, and that's almost 10% of the people voting. So 10%, is that enough to win an election? Of course not. It's really good for just having been in existence for 2 years, but what can 10% of the population do? It can decide which of the other 2 parties is going to win. So 10% is not enough to win yourself, but it is enough to influence the next election. And so that is really important. The populists showed that they are a force to be reckoned with, and something that the other 2 parties could not ignore. Following the election of 1892, Grover Cleveland comes into office, and as soon as he does, the economy completely collapsed into the worst economic collapse in U.S. history to that time. As the country gets more advanced, economic collapses get worse and worse and worse. And the Panic of 1893, it was called the Great Depression until the Great Depression. And it was really bad. About 20% of the U.S. was unemployed. And it obviously was a complete disaster. No. For our purposes, what is important about this? Who do Americans blame when the economy collapses? Whoever's in office. He literally just got into office and it collapsed like a few months later. But in general, Americans don't care about that. Whoever's in office, the party in power, they are usually voted out. That is just the norm. Whether they're responsible or not, the party in power gets blamed. So the Democrats, they're going to lose. Grover Cleveland did everything he could. Well, not everything. He did a lot of things to combat the Depression, but it was all very pro-business. It was so pro-business that Republicans actually loved his policies. But he's going to be losing the next election, obviously. And the collapse wasn't his fault, but obviously he got blamed for it. So coming up to the election of 1896, Republicans were ecstatic. They are going to win this election. And so they will nominate a guy named William McKinley. McKinley was just all out pro-business. He is a Republican. He was governor in Ohio. And he will support like the protective tariff and the gold standard. So just intensely pro-business. That is one of the long-running themes in like the Republican Party. It has always been the party that supports policies that are pro-business. McKinley got the nomination, and he is endorsing some very pro-business policies. The Democrats held their convention in Chicago, and one long-running thing about the Democratic Party is it just makes so little sense as a party. Obviously, the South is solidly Democratic at this period, but also there were like big cities in the North where a lot of them were Democratic. A lot of immigrants were for the Democratic Party. That's something that's consistent, and that's not my opinion. There was a comedian in the 1920s that said, "I'm not part of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." Because even today, Democratic Party is just like, it's such a random cluster of groups. That was true back then, just like it's true now. So there was a big fight for who was going to get the nomination at the convention. So this is the days when you get to a presidential convention and you don't know who's going to be president. Everyone's fighting for it, you know. Now we know who's going to be the presidential candidate way before the convention. So the convention is just like a ceremony where they're going to coronate the person. Back then it was an actual fight, and the fight was very intense. There was the part of the Democratic Party that was very pro-Cleveland and pro-business, and there was the majority of the party that was pro-reform. So the Democratic Party was split along those lines. There was the faction like Grover Cleveland that wanted the gold standard and pro-business policies, and then there was the faction that wanted reform, and that turned out to be the majority of the people at the convention. And so when they met after bitter fighting, they will adopt as their platform a very reform-minded platform, like lowering the tariff, obviously not pro-business, breaking up monopolies, progressive income tax, free silver, and regulating the railroads. Now, if you notice, a lot of those things are things that the Populists had called for. They just dropped the more radical ones, government ownership of railroads, telephone, telegraphs. Instead, they called for government regulation of those. And they didn't call for the sub-treasury system, because that was considered radical at the time. So it was obvious that the party was dominated by people that wanted reform now. And this brought onto the scene one of the most insane political stories in U.S. history. And it involves this guy right here, William Jennings Bryan. Bryan, he came to the convention a no-name. No one had any idea who he was. He is the least likely person you could imagine being a presidential candidate. For one, he was 36 years old. According to the Constitution, you have to be 35. So he was 1 year over the constitutional limit. He's also from the state of Nebraska. Usually we get candidates from big states, so they get the electoral votes. Nebraska is tiny in terms of population. It had like 6 electoral votes. And it was a solidly Republican state historically. They actually had a saying in Nebraska: Nebraska will go Democrat when hell goes Methodist. So it is a solidly Republican state. He is not at all the person that you would expect to be a presidential candidate. But the thing he had going for him, more than anything else, is his voice. He is, to this day, one of the greatest speakers in American history. And he was just captivating. He had a phenomenal voice, great cadence, just an amazing speaker. And also, he said things Americans like. Specifically, he was incredibly democratic, as in little d democratic, like Jefferson democratic, like the people can do no wrong. So he always talked about the people, the people are always right, and if it's the voice of the people, it's the voice of God. The second thing is he was intensely religious, and so all of his speeches involved democracy, lowercase d, and religion. So he gets to the convention. No one has any idea who he is, and there was a debate at the convention about whether the party would support the gold standard or free silver, and so a lot of people wanted gold standard, and more people wanted free silver. So there was a debate. There was 5 speakers, 3 promoting silver, 2 promoting gold. Bryan got to be one of those, and he made himself the last speaker, because if you want to convince an audience, you always be the last speaker, because the audience generally remembers the last thing they heard. Other speakers went, and then Bryan gets up, and he gives the most amazing speech anyone had ever heard. And again, there's never been anything like this in U.S. history. He gets up and he gives a speech, and saying democracy, saying religious things, and he ends his speech by saying, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor your crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold." He put his arms out like Jesus being crucified. Took a breath, looked around. The place was just silent. It was an eerie silence. No one was even coughing. And he starts walking down, and 30 seconds after he finishes, the place explodes. People are screaming. There are people literally sobbing, saying, "I've heard the voice of God." And because of that one speech, William Jennings Bryan, a guy who no one knew and who was not a likely candidate, will become the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. It's so funny, too, because if you read the actual speech, none of it makes any economic sense. It's all very emotional, which that's what a good political speech is supposed to be. But it really is just he's saying a bunch of words that don't actually mean anything. But he did it phenomenally well, and he will get the presidential nomination. So now we have William Jennings Bryan, Democratic candidate, who supports reform, especially the gold standard or free silver, lowering of the tariff, progressive income tax, a lot of the things that the populists wanted, but not all of them. William McKinley, he represents the Northeast, big business, banks, corporations. So this is a real contest. And the election of 1896 is one of the most important in U.S. history because it changes the parties. And also, this is a true question of America's future, which is William McKinley, versus America's past, which was William Jennings Bryan. So now there is a real political contest, and the populists have a choice. So Democrats are the party that were in power during the Depression. They are likely going to lose. They are offering the populists a lot of what the populists want, except government ownership of railroads, telephones, telegraphs, really radical part, and the sub-treasury system. So they're offering the populists something, but not everything. So the populists had to decide what they wanted to do, and they decided to fuse. This is what generally happens in the United States with third parties. One of the major parties will offer some of the things, but not the more extreme things. And when third parties fuse, that is the end of that party. They will go out of existence. So the populists, there was intense debate within the populists, but they will fuse with the Democratic Party. So now it's the Democrats and the Populist Party running against William McKinley and the Republican Party. The Republicans had overwhelmingly more money. The numbers were, for the time especially, were staggering. You know, today it's normal for really rich people and corporations to spend tons of money in campaigns, but this broke all records up to that point. Standard Oil alone spent more money than the entire Democratic Party. Well, they had so much money. William McKinley, he didn't even leave his house in Ohio. People would come to him, reporters would come to him, and he'd give his speech from his patio, but he did not leave his house. Bryan, he traveled something like 15,000 miles. It was his best gift was himself. And so he traveled all over the country, gave some 600 speeches. It averaged about 20 speeches a day. And people came out from all over to hear him speak. One guy actually told him, "I rode 100 miles to hear you speak, and it was the greatest decision I've ever made. I'd vote for you if you weren't a Democrat." I mean, his speaking was just absolutely amazing, and the whole country was really intensely involved in this because it's a real choice between a reform candidate of the past and a business candidate that represents the U.S. economic future. And the future won. William McKinley will win by 51% of the popular vote versus Bryan's 47% of the popular vote. And in the Electoral College, he wins overwhelmingly. So William Jennings Bryan lose the election. And the election of 1896 had a record turnout. So of eligible voters, which obviously doesn't include women and minorities, but a record amount of people came out, and Bryan still lost the election. It was the most sectional vote. Bryan gets all the Midwest and South. It was the most sectional vote since Civil War. This is a super interesting side note. If you know L. Frank Baum, he's the guy that wrote The Wizard of Oz, and it came out in like 1900. Supposedly, The Wizard of Oz, Frank Baum, he was a populist, and it's about this movement, this populist movement, and this election. The Scarecrow represents, in the book, the Scarecrow represents farmers and how bad farmers were doing. The Tin Man represents labor and how bad labor was doing. And the lion that finds his voice, that's William Jennings Bryan. Also, if you've ever read the book and not seen the movie, Dorothy's Slippers, ruby red. In the book, they're silver. So the yellow brick road, that is the gold standard, it's leading to a false god. And the answer was silver all along. That's why in the book the shoes are silver. Supposedly William McKinley, he is the wizard, but not like he is the wizard's face, not the person behind the scene that was actually pulling the levers and controlling him. And yeah, because they were incredibly racist back then, so supposedly the flying monkeys were supposed to be the freed slaves. So, random fun fact for you.